Okay, thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar hosted by the UK Competitive Telecommunications Association, which will address regulatory reform in telecoms to drive economic growth. My name is Ochan Gen. I'm an economist and I'm a director at Plum Consulting, and I'm happy to introduce this session today. My colleague Chris Taylor, who's a partner at Plum, will be presenting the work he has led. And this event will be recorded and will then be available on our YouTube channel. And during the presentation, you can submit your questions in the Q&A section of Teams. And Chris will address them at the end of his presentation. I will now hand over Dougal Robinson, who is chairman at UKTA. And Dougal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aude. Much appreciated. And good morning, everybody. Many of you I know, and I'm sure many of you also are aware what UKTA is and what we're about. But just for the record, UKTA is a trade association focusing particularly on the on infrastructure competition in the fixed telecoms market. Our membership includes some 13 members, all of whom are competitors to BT as well as each other. So all of us, I think, all the membership has an interest in infrastructure investment and infrastructure competition. It's now 20 years, I think, since UKTA was formed. We were formed almost coincidentally with the Communications Act in 2003, during which time we've seen an increasing focus, I think, from policymakers on protecting consumer interests and consumer rights and minimizing the potential to harm that can exist online. What has fallen away in that time, I think, has been an industrial strategy focus or a policy focus that strategically analyzes the infrastructure that underlies all of the services that our member companies provide. One of the key questions is why are we having this report now? To which there are several reasons really, but one of which is that we're now 4 years into a post-Brexit UK, and we're starting to see gaps appear between the regulatory framework in the UK and in the EU, and there will be opportunities for UK benefit, I'm sure, coming out of those gaps in areas like cybersecurity, like artificial intelligence, and so forth, and these opportunities are also, I think, recognised by the incoming UK administration. Now, timing-wise, I think we have a pretty short window to hit the desks of those that are influencing government policy and regulatory strategy. The government spending review, which is a very major, going to have a major impact during the term of this current government, is due around March. Around March, we're also likely to see an infrastructure review from the government. That's a putative timescale at least. And thirdly, we're going to see a fairly substantial change, I think, in global economic landscape, particularly with the incoming US administration, which is likely to disrupt the current status quo in terms of international trade. So again, the UK has an opportunity to position itself as an attractive place for investment for the big investors, both domestically and foreign investors, and to ensure that the infrastructure that we all rely on is as well supported as possible. So with that sort of brief introduction, I'm going to hand over now to Chris for the main body of the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dougal, and thank you, Aude. Let me just share the slides I'm going to present. Hopefully you can all see that now.
Yes, it works.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm very pleased to be able to present a summary of the work that we've done for UKTA. As Ord says, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A, but I don't want to make this a completely mute session. If you'd rather speak, raise your hand, and we'll open your mic. I'm looking at my screen and all I can see is my slides, so I won't actually be able to look at Q&A till the end. So I'm relying on Ord to let me know if there's a question coming up through a raised hand, but we'll deal with those at the end as well. Just to introduce myself, it's nice to see some friends and colleagues, people I know on the call, but those of you who don't know me, I'm a partner for Plum Consulting. Plum is quite a small consultancy firm. We're focused in the telecoms media space, in regulation and policy. We also have a very strong presence in spectrum management and radio engineering. As I said, we're a small company. There's 15 of us in all. Most of us in London, 3 of us including Ord in France, and 1 of us down in New Zealand. So we can legitimately claim to have global reach. I guess those of you who know me will also remember that before Plum and before I started consultancy, I did quite a few years at Ofcom, including being director of consumer policy. So I have a little bit of skin in this game, I guess. Just to start this off then with a bit of a kind of big picture statement to introduce the theme. I was going to say next year is an important year for the electronic communications sector. We probably say that every year though, don't we? But the reasons that I'm saying that now, firstly is that Ofcom and industry will be looking very closely at wholesale and access markets in the telecoms access review. So there's going to be a big emphasis on upstream markets, access markets, and the new regulatory framework for those markets and that part of the value chain will be critical, I think, in defining the health of the sector going forward. We also, since there's been a change of government, understand that the new administration is preparing for a statement of strategic priorities. And of course, that has much broader scope than just upstream access and wholesale regulation. And we haven't seen anything published yet on the scope of that, but it's probably going to be quite far reaching. So in our study for UKTA, we looked primarily at downstream of access. So we looked at retail markets. And as I'll explain, I think it's quite important to take stock of the fact that these were mainly found to be competitive as long ago as 2009. However, they still feature quite a lot of sector-specific regulation. And so, as I'll try and explain and develop our arguments through this presentation, we think, and we've advised UKTA, that we think now is a good time to take a look at those markets again. So a bit more context. When I first started discussing this project with Rosaline and then subsequently with the UKTA board, we were thinking broadly about the anniversary of the Communications Act, which of course became law in 2003, and how we might do some research and a study to mark that passing of that anniversary. Of course, quite a lot has changed since we started the project, and principally we have a new government in place, and that new government, as well as starting to develop a statement of strategic priorities, is also working on consultation on an industrial strategy. So there are big implications there potentially for our sector. When Dugald introduced me, he also mentioned this change of the government in the US. And I must admit, one of the things we haven't factored into our research or recommendations is a Trump administration. But of course, that is relevant context. You know, the world is a changing place, and the UK is in a different position than it was quite a few years ago now. And the sector is important in that. So we looked at, within that brief, we looked specifically at sector-specific regulation in competitive markets. We also looked at the evolution of Ofcom's role and duties, and they have changed significantly, as I'm sure all of you know on this call, since the Communications Act, but also quite a lot in more recent years as well. And then we also looked at the landscape for scrutiny of and challenge to regulatory decisions, which has also changed very significantly, particularly since the Digital Economy Act in 2017. So with that context, this is how the agenda looks for this short session this morning. Firstly, we're just going to have a look at how the sector is performing, and I don't have a whole lot of detailed metrics, but some high-level things just to demonstrate actually that the sector is performing well. I'm sure you'll agree. Secondly, we're going to look at the centerpiece, I think, for this session, which is how regulation is running now in electronic communications markets which are competitive. So we're not looking upstream, we're not looking at access markets. When I first started speaking to UKCTA about this report, we decided deliberately that we weren't going to look at the Telecoms Access Review because there is so much other work going on in that space. So we've focused our lens way downstream of that, mainly at retail markets, which are outside of SMP regulation. As I said, we're going to look at scrutiny and challenge of regulatory decisions and look at how that landscape has changed. And then finally, I'm going to try and piece all of that together and run you through our conclusions and recommendations, which you'll also find in our study. And by the way, I put a link to the report, which was published a couple of weeks ago now, our report for UKCTA. I put a link to that in the meeting chat, and you can find it both on the Plum website, which I've linked, but also on the UKCTA website. So firstly, as I said, let's just take a very quick look at how the sector is performing, which hasn't been the main part of our research. But if we're going to consider whether regulation remains appropriate in certain areas, we also need to look at what the outcomes are for our stakeholders, particularly for consumers. So very quickly, I'm sure any of you who are avid followers of Ofcom's Connected Nations report will recognise some of this data. And we've looked at two things quickly. One is on the supply side, so looking at investment and connectivity. And then I have a slide on more demand side, consumer satisfaction and so on. So firstly, on the supply side, Ofcom now tells us that superfast coverage, and it's funny to think that superfast coverage, I believe, is still defined as 30 meg and above. That is now available to 97% of households. Over 100 megabit connectivity download is available to 80%, gigabit coverage to 78%, and direct fiber coverage to 61%. And the graph shows that, you know, those trend lines are increasing over the years. So there has been very, very significant investment by industry in connectivity, but not just in raw connectivity, in quality of service, reliability, all the things that come with direct fiber connections over the last few years. And certainly we know from work we've done in Plum, other studies we've done where we've benchmarked outside of the UK. We know that the UK has really caught up, particularly in its fiber connectivity, and benchmarks well with other major European nations now. Now, because we were working for UKCTA, we haven't really focused on mobile quality of service or mobile consumer experience, but it would be a bit remiss to leave it out of this slide, which is talking about, you know, headline levels of connectivity and how they've improved. And so I've just made a note there again from the Connected Nations report on 4G coverage, which is now geographically available across 93% of the country. Moving on then to customer satisfaction, some demand side indicators. And I'm sure that any of you who work for UK providers will say that there's always room for improvement in customer satisfaction, and none of us should be complacent about this. But again, the data shows that consumers are reasonably satisfied with their broadband service, and complaints to Ofcom about broadband continue to trend very, very low at below 0.02%. So customers are broadly happy, and I think, you know, we can link that to the investment that has taken place over the years in network upgrades, in fibre rollout, because we know that quality of service is not just about quality of customer service, but it's also about the quality of connectivity and the experience that that customers have through their connection. So we've just taken a very brief look at metrics to suggest that the market and the industry is performing pretty well, both on the supply and the demand sides. So I'm going to move on now to talk about the central theme of our study, and this is looking at regulation in competitive electronic communications markets, so not the ones where we find SMP. To do this, I just want to take a step back really and look at how regulation has worked over the years. And for some of us who are veterans in the industry, and that's me, by the way, you know, this approach to regulation goes back before the Communications Act even. It is very well established and it's proven to be quite successful. And what regulators have done, not just in the UK but globally, is identify areas of the value chain that are particular risk of market failure, and that's where they focused regulation. You will recall that regulation at the point of liberalisation tends to cover the whole value chain, from access all the way downstream into retail, because incumbents tend to be strong at each point of the value chain at the point at which markets are liberalised. But some of those points are easier for new entrants to compete in than others, and so retail markets tend to become competitive fairly quickly, relatively quickly, but that is dependent on there being strong regulation upstream at the wholesale level and at the access level. So retail market entry has been supported by regulation of SMP and bottleneck facilities. And you can see there on the screen, uncontroversially, the characteristics we've listed for access markets. They have high entry costs and high entry costs. And so regulation upstream has supported competition downstream, and as competition became established in those downstream markets, then regulation could withdraw from them. And of course, now we're at a point where we're seeing competition and strong market entry even upstream. So you could say that this approach to regulation has worked very well. Coming on to that particular point in this slide now, this system of regulation has worked well in Europe and the UK. And whilst Dougal has introduced, you know, Brexit to the discussion, and it's a very relevant topic that we're no longer part of Europe, it's also important to remember that until 4 years ago, the UK was part of the European regulatory framework. And we can see how the system I've described has worked really well, both in the UK and Europe. And I think it's quite powerful to, if you'll forgive me, look at the European framework evolution, the way the European Electronic Communications Code has evolved through various iterations, and the fact that retail markets have become absent from that list of markets which are susceptible to ex-ante regulation. And that has happened as competition in retail markets has become stronger as a result of robust regulation upstream in wholesale markets. So you can see that in 2002, there were actually 7 retail markets in the list of markets which were susceptible to ex-ante regulation. In 2014, retail had been removed from that list of candidate markets, and now there are only 2 access and wholesale markets in scope of the European Electronic Communications Code, to the extent that they are regarded as being susceptible to ex-ante regulation. And any of you who follow the debate in Europe, as we do closely, will know that there are some advocates in Europe for dismantling of the whole kind of framework of susceptible markets. So the European Commission, DG Connect, issued a white paper, in which one of the suggestions they had was to remove any concept of susceptible markets. I can tell you that suggestion didn't go down very well with anyone other than access incumbents. Looking at the UK, I don't want to repeat this too many times, but it is important for our study. SMP regulation in downstream retail markets was removed in the market reviews of 2009. So we're now 15 years down the road of competition in retail markets in UK electronic communications. However, since SMP regulation was withdrawn, we've seen some proliferation in the sector-specific rules which apply to retail markets. We looked at, in our study for UKCTA, we looked at the period in the second half of the last decade, so since 2016. And you can see that in the left-hand column, a list of new regulatory provisions which have been added to the general conditions of entitlement since 2016. This includes quite a lot of rules which were added as a result of the transposition in the UK of the European Electronic Communications Code. And there's a lot here, a lot of very familiar rules covering consumer switching, covering contract requirements, consumer information, and so on. And most recently, the latest one we added to the list was the ban on inflation indexation of price changes mid-contract, which was this year. On the right-hand side, you can see that no regulation has been removed in these markets during the same period. And this is in the context of Ofcom's stated preference to keep intervention to a minimum. And in fact, you know, having researched this and gone back to the review of general conditions in 2016-17, we see that they weren't really expecting to remove any retail markets from regulation. They said, we have actively considered opportunities for deregulation, but we have come to the view that most of the consumer protection conditions are not good candidates for significant deregulation. And then subsequently in the years since then, we haven't seen any reductions in the scope of regulation on these competitive retail markets. What we have seen is the increases, which we've listed on the left-hand side of the slide pack there. So I'm not going to sit in front of you, though, and say that regulation to protect consumers isn't important. It can be very important, even in competitive markets, because there are some features of consumer behaviour which suggest that they might need help with certain decisions. So there's inertia, which is probably one of the biggest obstacles to consumer engagement. And inertia can be for a number of reasons, but I think the most common one is that those of us who consume communications and media services all the time are just very busy with other stuff. So we're not necessarily going to get involved frequently with contract renewal or switching decisions. So inertia is strong, and there are other consumers who find it difficult to engage for other reasons. And another reason is imperfect information. So it can be complex trying to find your way around all the various options in a competitive market. And Ofcom has chosen to become very involved in those areas of consumer decision making. However, we also know, and I think the best regulators, including Ofcom, will acknowledge this, there are big risks in regulation. And there can be failures. There can be failure in the design of regulation, failures in implementation, inefficiency, unintended consequences to regulation. And I think one which is particularly important in dynamic markets is regulation can become obsolete because we are in a very fast-paced, evolving market in which technology drives change, in which consumer demand drives change. And so setting static regulatory rules in a way which is not then under review and is not under continual check to understand whether interventions remain effective means that there's a big risk that regulatory rules can become obsolete fairly quickly. And we suggest in our report for UKCTA there are particular reasons to be cautious in competitive retail electronic communications markets, and there's a summary of conclusions here. So firstly, as we know, there is robust cross-sectoral framework for consumer protection in the UK. The UK is a very well regulated country, and there are consumer protection rules in the Consumer Rights Act, unfair trading regulations, and so on. And so any regulation in the consumer space needs to be checked to be regulator needs to be sure that they are not duplicating existing regulation. A second point is compliance costs. So we know that companies who are regulated are finding the rules which they have to comply are increasing and also more complex to comply with. Not just talking about the general conditions here, but there are other requirements as well. For example, the requirements of the Telecommunications Security Act. And in our report, we did a bit of research with UKTA members, and there is a range of compliance costs increase over the last 5 years, which are very significant in that range between 20 and 50%. Another fact here, which I haven't included in this summary, but which is covered in our research, is the difficulty in finding people who have the knowledge and skills. So there are recruitment difficulties for companies having to comply with an ever increasingly set of regulatory rules. Interventions may have hidden opportunity costs, and so regulators do routinely do regulatory impact assessments, but they will often not capture some of the more difficult to measure costs like opportunity costs. And so for all the money invested in regulatory compliance, that could be spent elsewhere, could possibly spent in areas of the business which will drive innovation and customer service benefits to consumers. So there are opportunity costs and they need to be considered carefully. Providers are not all the same. Some of the big providers have a greater ability to absorb costs than some of the smaller ones, and some of the regulatory interventions require big fixed costs which don't necessarily scale. And so proportionality is not a one-size-fits-all model, and regulators need to take care to consider that. As we know, rules which were designed for consumers are also applied to small businesses. Now, Ofcom has issued guidance here, and I think everyone acknowledges the difficult area because we have some business customers who just basically behave like residential consumers. They might be sole traders living at home, and so of course they're protected by consumer protection provisions. There are some very large businesses who can look after themselves. They have teams dealing with contracts and due diligence. But then there is this small and medium-sized business category defined as Ofcom as 10 employees and below. And some of the protections in place for them were designed solely on the basis of research, which was focused only on domestic residential customers. And so that's another area which we need to be careful of. And then finally, changes to the appeals standard since 2017, which I'm going to talk about in more detail, which has made it more difficult to scrutinise and challenge regulatory decisions. Just time check. Okay, so looking at this before I wrap up, I think most of you on the call will understand that the landscape for scrutiny and challenge has changed significantly. Firstly, as a result of Brexit, because before the UK left the European Union, regulatory decisions were subject to compliance oversight by the Commission, who check every member state for compliance with the Electronic Communications Code. And that's no longer part of our governance in the UK. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but it does mean there's a layer of scrutiny on Ofcom decisions which has been removed. And then secondly, changes to the appeals regime, which were made in 2017, so quite some time ago now, but in the period we're studying, and they were made in a Digital Economy Act. One of my favourite charts in our report is this one on the right, which shows the reduction in appeals of Ofcom decisions under the Communications Act 2003, appeals to the CAT, before that change to the DEA between 2010 and 2017. The sector was quite litigious, I would say. in appeals to the CAT, and we've listed there 37 appeals in that period. In the period since then, so in the 7 years since then, just 5. Now, we did a little bit of digging into this because whilst on the face of it, I think it is a reasonable assumption to say, well, that reduction in appeals, it's because of the change to the appeals standard from full merits appeal to something closer to judicial review. We didn't want to conclude that without some further analysis. So we thought, well, is it as a result of the number of Ofcom consultations and decisions? That little chart, the little line chart on the right, tells you it isn't. There has been roughly consistent number of regulatory decisions during that period. And secondly, we thought, well, is it because industry is more accepting or is less resistant to Ofcom decisions? I haven't included this in the slide pack, but we ran a little analysis on that too to see whether Ofcom, which was making more decisions which were being accepted by industry, and an analysis of consultation responses told us, no, things haven't changed much there. So that, I think, validates that this change in the frequency in the number of appeals is a result of the change to the appeal standard, which means that really less transparency is needed in order to justify a decision because less decisions are appealable. Now, the previous government did some work on this, and I have to say I don't know where that's going now since the change of government. They had their smarter regulation consultation in which they went out to consult stakeholders, and many stakeholders in this sector, I believe, called for more transparent decision making and also better use by the regulator of post-implementation reviews so they could have more transparency about whether regulatory interventions and remedies were working as they intended and whether they were actually making life easier for consumers as they were designed to do. Okay, so moving now to my last part of this before we move on. So as I noted at the start, and Dougal did as well, the political environment around us has changed, and actually it changed during the period of our study in a very interesting way. We know the government has a consultation open on their industrial strategy, but also that there are plans in place for a new statement of strategic review of priorities for the sector, which will be the first one since 2019 was the last time that happened. Both the last government and this government have placed strong emphasis on economic growth, and so we would suggest in all of these initiatives, economic growth should be a centerpiece, and certainly the smarter regulation consultation issued by the last government looked at ways in which regulation could be streamlined in order to foster and encourage economic growth. So with that in mind, our recommendations to UKCTA in our report have been that there should be a fresh look at regulation of competitive electronic communications market, taking account of the emphasis on growth that I've just mentioned. The importance of regulation in upstream markets. So many of you on this call, perhaps your biggest work item in the next year will be the Telecoms Access Review, thinking about SMP in access markets, what that means for investment and so on. We did not address that in this study, but we suggest there are other areas of the regulatory framework and other points in the value chain where regulatory reform should be considered. This should consider the risk of regulating generally in competitive markets. As a general principle, competition should be the driver of consumer benefit and regulation should be used as sparingly as possible. That also should take account of the existing framework for cross-sectoral consumer protection. We looked in our report, I've mentioned it today, but I haven't made it a big feature of this presentation. We looked at the balance of evidence between residential consumers and business customers in setting consumer protection measures. I think that is a difficult area for the regulator to address, and they need to continue to be vigilant to ensure they're getting it right. Any review should look at the opportunity costs of intervention, and we would suggest that in doing cost-benefit analysis and regulatory intervention assessment, impact assessments, it should be best practice to look as closely as possible, as much as you can, at opportunity costs, what opportunities might be being prevented as a result of putting an emphasis and putting resources into regulatory compliance, but also into the implementation of regulatory measures. The complexity of compliance requirements, which stakeholders have told us the burden of regulation has just grown in recent years, which means compliance is more difficult, more costly, and sometimes difficult to find people to do. The impact of interventions on smaller providers, as I've said, proportionality, whilst I think there is a tendency to look at it in aggregate across the sector, it's actually not a one-size-fits-all thing, and some interventions will impact smaller providers in a way which is much more difficult for them to manage than it is for larger providers. There's the dynamic nature of this market and the need to be satisfied that interventions continue to be effective and proportionate, through as much use as we can, I think, of post-implementation evaluation. There are advantages and of principled and outcomes-focused regulation. Again, this is a feature of our research for UKCTA. Some of the rules which are put in place now are quite specific, requiring particular processes. There are advantages to making regulation more outcomes focused and giving more discretion to industry to design a solution which suits them, as long as it meets the objective the regulators set. It's now 4 years since Brexit, and I think the UK remains best in class, or one of the best in class, in terms of its implementation of the European Electronic Communications Code. Of course, the UK government now has a lot more discretion, and that is an area in which we suggest that there can be considered in a review of competition in competitive markets. And finally, following on that point about the DEA and the changes to the appeals standard and the suggestion that there's less transparency as a result of that, following up the last government's work on smarter regulation, we think a review could consider improvements to transparency of decision making, and this would boost confidence in the sector. Thank you very much. I'll now turn my presentation off site and see if I've got questions.
Thank you, Chris.
Pleasure.
I don't see any questions for now. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Yeah, Andrea.
I can ask a quick question. Chris, obviously Ofcom have now had its impact assessment guidelines for a little while, and I guess it'd be interesting to monitor how those work in post-evaluation and even deciding regulation. I'm not sure whether you've had a chance to have a look at that as part of this work, or whether that's kind of like a useful next step to monitor.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So absolutely, impact assessments are important. What I haven't seen is, and maybe because I've missed it, is publication of very many impact assessments post-implementation of some of the interventions we're talking about. So I know there was one about on end of contract notifications, but certainly that's part of our recommendation, is that as much use as possible should be made of post intervention evaluations, and actually that should be baked into the framework for sure.
I think it'd be interesting to see if one of the early chapters in the TAR is an evaluation of what the outcome of the previous 5 years has been, and therefore how do we move forward for the next 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect that to be part of the consultation, is a look at how, the efficacy of remedies that have been in place. But yeah, thanks, Andrea. Geeta, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I don't know about anybody else, but I can't actually access a Q&A app.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's a glitch there. On the appeal options, do you have any thoughts? I mean, so you pointed out that challenges to Ofcom decisions had reduced substantially since 2017. Now, I've been involved myself, submitted a lot of that data to government as part of the smarter regulation thing that they did last year and early this year prior to the change of government. Do you have any ideas about, what could or should be done in that context in terms of maybe, because one of the things we found when I did the work on it was that we found that as a consequence of the change in appeal standards, the transparency of Ofcom's decisions reduced substantially because they didn't have to be transparent because they weren't accountable in the same way as before. So it's not just an accountability, it's a transparency. And if you haven't got transparency, you don't know whether you can appeal. So it's kind of a vicious circle. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so firstly, Geeta, apologies for the Q&A. So secondly, I'm not a law firm, so I'm kind of, I'm cautious about getting into technical discussion about standards of appeal and so on. But I think actually the way I'd like to answer that is more with reference to the other point which you made. And the way I'd put that is, just because there is a different appeal standard doesn't mean there needs to be less transparency. Those two things don't follow automatically. And the previous government, as you've said, was doing some work on this in the smarter regulation consultation, during which a lot of stakeholders made the same point that you've just articulated, which is transparency seems to be, there's less transparency since, I guess, the appeals regime became less tough for Ofcom. And so I think my answer to that would be, well, there needs to be higher standards of transparency, and whether that is through post-implementation evaluation or better explanation of interventions during the consultation phase. I think that's absolutely the first job to do, and I'll leave the question about whether the current standard of appeal is the right one to other experts. Thanks. So apologies about the Q&A function. If other people have been trying to ask questions and failing, we can keep going, and please do raise your hand.
I think it's working for some of the people. There's a comment from Rosalind. Do you want to read it, Chris, or do you want me to read it?
Well, I can say it. I just wanted to say that what I was saying there was that on the TAR, what I found, and I'm be interested to hear if actual CPs have found this as well, is that there is very little memory, and that the team is organizational memory within Ofcom, and the team is pretty new. So they're on a steep learning curve, and it's our obligation, if I could put it like that, to be as open and communicative with them as possible, so that they can, they're very willing to engage with us, but we need to engage with them to ensure that we jolt some thoughts that maybe they haven't, they're not aware of, because they're a pretty new team. Like you, Chris, some of us have got quite long memories, but not necessarily are so involved in this with Ofcom.
Yeah, Dom, see your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Rosalind, although I think it's alarming that you've raised the prospect in my mind that myself and lots of friends are veterans of this industry. That's quite scary. But yeah, we've had some discussions with Ofcom, not in the retail market, obviously, but in the wholesale. And I know Geeta had a conversation recently where one of the things we've been talking about on the PIA product, for example, is that we want to have a longer contract term offered, so that when you're bidding for things like BDUK contracts, you can, you're being asked to provide a service for 20 years, but Open only offers you 5. And Ofcom said that they couldn't possibly require an incumbent to offer a longer term that was longer than a market review period. But as Geeta then pointed out to them, they offered a 5-year term when it was a 3-year market review, and Ofcom just kind of looked a bit bit baffled. So I would echo totally what Rosalie's saying, that there's a lack of depth of experience on their part, and it really is incumbent on all of us to help them out with that.
Thanks, Dom. Okay, Ord, I can't see anything in the Q&A or the chat, so if you're seeing it, let me know.
Yeah, we have another one from Mariko. You can't see the Q&A, Chris. Do you want me to read the question?
Yeah, please.
So TSA rules set by Ofcom impose stricter security regs on telecoms operators to protect networks. However, interpreting and implementing the rules can be tricky. I hasten to add I'm no TSA expert, or there's SMEs in Virgin Media O2 who are, so excuse my basic question. Curious whether Plum aware whether Ofcom acknowledges the complexity of TSA and will support with greater guidance on interpretation. Also, what is Plum's experience of other operators' feedback on TSA?
Okay, thanks for the question. So just to firstly agree, I think one of the things, so our research really was focused on the general conditions, but as often happens in a research project, you get led in areas you weren't expecting, and one of those areas was the TSA, because when I looked at compliance burden on industry, it's clear that by far the most costly intervention, which is outside of Ofcom actually, the most costly intervention that providers are having to comply with is rules under the TSA. And I'm sure that, as you say, implementation is tricky. I'm not sure of Ofcom's position on it. I don't, this isn't an area which is solely within Ofcom's remit. So I'm probably not the right expert in Plum to talk about this. Actually, we do have other experts in Plum who are much closer to the network security and resilience debate. And if you want to take that offline, I can connect you with them. But thanks. Dom, you've got your hand up again, and Rosalind's made a point.
Wholeheartedly agree with what Mariko said. Unfortunately, I do sit in lots of meetings about TSA, but I think it goes to one of your points in the report, Chris, about transparency. And I know this isn't just a City Fibre issue. I've heard it from colleagues at BT and plenty of other operators. We're all doing our best to comply. We're sending information into Ofcom when requested, and then we're saying, how was that? Was it too much, too little? Was it the wrong stuff? And they just say, we cannot give you legal advice. You need to speak to lawyers. It's completely opaque. And it's not good.
So there's a couple of comments here from Rosaline and then from Geeta. So Mariko, Rosaline's pointed out that UKTA raised this point with Ofcom recently. You may have seen the short note on it, which is going to forward to you. And then Geeta's made the point about tier 3 providers and TSA compliance, particularly difficult for them, which I think goes to some of the points we were making about proportionality and size. So obviously, I understand the requirements on tier 3s are different from tier 1s and 2s. So the TSA is an area that we haven't done intensive research on for this study, but Mariko, if you want to speak offline, I can connect you with our team who deal with that.
Thank you. And Domhnall, just so you know, I do get questions as the lawyer, and I go, "Oh, let me try and work it out," and it's not easy.
I think that might be why Ofcom don't necessarily reach out as voluntarily as we might expect them to do, but they do seem prepared to, if you ask, to at least meet and go through stuff. So I guess it's one of those things again where we have to push the door. The door's slightly ajar, but it's, no one's monitoring it.
Can I pick up Geeta's next question? Did OTS compliance feature highly on compliance concerns? Geeta, I think the answer is no, but that was because of the timing of our research, not because of the fact that people aren't concerned about it. Obviously, it's a major new piece of compliance which UKTA members and other providers have had to implement this year. I think it's one of the biggest ones. Most of the people we spoke to, I think I can say, were getting on with it, but that's probably because most of the people we spoke to were the bigger providers. And we know it's a major piece of compliance work across the sector. A lot of this research was actually done, at the end of last year, so it wasn't right at the front of people's consciousness at that point.
I don't have any further questions. Let me check. Oh, yes. There's a comment from Colin. Regulatory housekeeping, clearing out old regulation if it's no longer appropriate, isn't a fun task. How can we sell the task project to Ofcom as something they should take on to ensure the UK regime is fit for the future?
Thanks, Colin. Well, send them this report, because in a way that's partly the intention, I think, of this research. I mean, I think the chart where we show new regulation since 2015 and regulation which has been removed, and that column is empty, I think it's quite powerful. I also think that if Ofcom regularly does post-implementation reviews and assessments of the efficacy and the effectiveness of remedies, then it should follow from that those that they find are no longer necessary or efficacious would be removed. I mean, it's so easy for regulators, I think, to become I suppose, prioritize what they're doing now and what they see the immediate priorities for now and the near-term future are, and not to look at clearing out the old stuff. So I think, maybe send them our report, but also, yes, I mean, when I was Ofcom, there were lots of people in Ofcom saying we need to look at some of the old stuff and get it off the books. But then there's not always easy to find the resources to do that.
Thanks, Chris. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it is a difficult task. It's like clearing out your wardrobe, isn't it? There's companies like Vinted for that, but Ofcom don't have a Vinted.
That might be a gap in the market. Thanks, Colin.
So no further questions. Some comments in the conversation section, Chris.
Yep. Okay, so let me just look at those. I think I'll pick up Andrea's and Geeta's, because Andrea, you asked me to comment on the post evaluation, and you've pointed out that that's done, but it doesn't really have any consultative part of it. So that's a good point. Several parts of the wholesale fixed telecoms market review that Ofcom has not implemented, even when reminded. Geeta, do you want to expand on that?
Particularly in relation to PIA, there are specific provisions in the WFTMR, for example, that all new or improved, amended systems or processes for PIA must be EOI compliant. Whenever we've taken that to Ofcom have said our means of checking if there's non-discrimination in the PIA market is the internal reference offer. And that's obviously after the event, that's not upfront. So if you want to make sure that anything that's changed is compliant with an is UI compliant, then it has to be an upfront kind of assessment process when they make changes. And they have consistently refused to engage with that. We've taken it right to the top. I have to say, recently, in the last month or two, they've changed their tune. I think I had a slight change of people in the team and stuff like that. But yes, I'm just using that as an example of you put your faith in what is said in the statement by Ofcom, and then you find that they don't do it.
Yeah, and that's about their compliance with SMP rules. I guess all of the same applies in terms of effective implementation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
So there's no further question.
Rosalind, do you want to wrap up?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Chris, and particularly Chris for doing the report, but obviously also very much to Ord, who's managed to get us on a webinar that that none of us had difficulty navigating, except perhaps for the Q&A bit. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, I think the message that I take away from today's call and from the comments in the chat is that there's an awful lot for Ofcom for Ofcom in the new world to do. We need to make sure that their lack of institutional history doesn't impact the way we move forward, and that whilst we might all be still sad about Brexit, there's no point worrying about that. We're in a brave new world, and we just got to get on and do things. And actually, some of the things to worry about are things we haven't had time to discuss today: AI. The impact that Ofcom's duties on online security and safety have in terms of how they deal with us as what we would consider to be a major part of the sector. And from the UKTA point of view, I think, thank you to those of you not from UKTA who joined the call today, but I think from the UKTA point of view, one thing I would say is that this is a very good starting point. This report and the slides are a very good starting point for us as we introduce ourselves to Natalie Black in the coming weeks. She has a lot to do with her new team. I think, Chris, you're going to remind everybody that this is going to be available on the Plum YouTube channel. I would suggest that we advertise that quite widely to especially to those people who weren't able to attend today, and just to say thank you, and let's see what changes we can make going forward.
Yeah. Okay. And as you say, it's going to be available. I just want to thank everyone as well for listening to me for most of the last hour. I want to thank UKTA for commissioning this, and I think most of you know how to find me at Plum if you want to chat about it. If you don't, you can just find our website.